Nora Everly shoved the stolen papers deep into the freight crate and slammed the lid just as boots hit the frozen mud outside the wagon. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The winter wind tore at the canvas walls. She pressed herself into the shadows between two tall crates, breath clouding in the bitter cold, and prayed the man climbing into his own wagon would not notice the broken seal on the third crate from the door. The lantern light swung wild as he hauled himself inside. She saw his silhouette, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with the easy balance of someone who lived on the road. Hollis Cutter. The freight foreman everyone in Blue Creek whispered about. Dangerous past, dangerous eyes, and a reputation for asking no questions as long as the pay was good. She had chosen his wagon precisely because he was leaving town at dawn, heading east toward the territorial office, and no one would think to search a drifter's freight for evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in 3 counties. She had not planned on him coming back early. She had not planned on being trapped inside when he did. He set the lantern on a hook and turned to latch the canvas flap against the wind. Nora held her breath. If she stayed silent, if she stayed still, he might check his manifest and leave again. He might not look inside the crates tonight. She could slip out after he walked back to the freight yard office. She could disappear into the alleys before he ever knew she had been here. But the wind gusted hard, rocking the wagon, and her boots scraped against the wooden floor. The sound was tiny. A mouse scratch. Nothing. He froze. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and his hand dropped to the revolver on his hip. His eyes found her in the shadows. For 3 long seconds, neither of them moved. Then he drew the gun, cocked it, and aimed it steady at her chest. His voice came low and flat, no heat in it, which made it worse. Step out where I can see you. Nora swallowed hard and stepped into the lantern light, hands raised to shoulder height, heart beating so loud she thought he must hear it. His eyes traveled over her face, her dress, her ink-stained fingers, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, more like a man revising his assumptions on the fly. He did not lower the gun. "You are the newspaper woman," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. "Nora Everly," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I run the Blue Creek Gazette." He studied her for another long beat. "Then why are you hiding in my freight wagon after dark, with your hands covered in ink and your coat half off, like you have been crawling through cargo?" She could lie. She could say she had been looking for a lost shipment, a missing subscriber list, anything. But this man had a deserter's eyes. He knew lies the way she knew type. So she lifted her chin and told him the only truth that might keep her alive. "Because I just stole something that could save this town, and if I do not get it to the territorial office in 3 days, an innocent family loses everything they own." His expression did not change. "And you hid this stolen something in my freight?" She nodded. He let out a breath through his nose, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something that might have been dark amusement. "Lady, you just made my life a hell of a lot more complicated." He lowered the hammer on the revolver, but did not holster it. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking hard. "Which crate?" She hesitated. He raised the gun again, just a fraction. "Which crate, Miss Everly?" She pointed to the third crate. He crossed to it, flipped the latch with one hand, lifted the lid. The papers sat on top of a load of dry goods, folded once, ink still fresh on the edges. He pulled them out, held them up to the lantern light, and read the top line. Then, he looked at her with something new in his face, something cold and weighing. These are land patents. Signed by Judge William Cord. Dated 2 weeks ago. She nodded. They prove he forged the sale of Juniper Ranch. He has been foreclosing on families all over the county using fake documentation and territorial bribes. If those papers reach the land office, the sales get voided, and the families get their homes back. If they do not, the Morrow family loses Juniper Ranch in 3 days, and Cord takes the water rights for the whole valley. Hollis folded the papers slowly and tucked them inside his coat. Then he holstered the revolver. Nora felt a rush of relief, so strong her knees nearly buckled. But he was not done. He leaned back against the crate and crossed his arms, watching her with that unreadable expression. "You know what you just did?" he said quietly. "You just committed theft, broke into private freight, and handed me evidence of a federal crime. If Cord finds out you took those papers, he will have you arrested. Or worse." She met his eyes. "I know." He shook his head. "No, I do not think you do. Cord owns the sheriff. He owns half the county. He has men who make people disappear when it suits him. You just painted a target on your back the size of this whole damn territory." She felt the truth of it settle into her bones like winter cold. But she did not look away. "I know what he is," she said. "I have been printing the truth about him for 6 months. He has already tried to run me out of town twice. This is the only way to stop him." Hollis studied her for a long moment. Then, he let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a curse. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met," he said, "or the most foolish." She smiled, bitter and small. "My father would say foolish." Hollis pushed off the crate and picked up the lantern. "Well, your father is not here, and neither is Cord. Yet." He moved toward the wagon flap, then paused and looked back at her. "You need to leave town tonight. If Cord does not know those papers are missing yet, he will by morning. And when he does, the first place he will look is your newspaper office." Nora shook her head. "I cannot leave. I have a paper to run. I have people depending on me." Hollis gave her a long, flat look. "You will have a grave to fill if you stay." Before she could answer, voices cut through the wind outside. Rough voices, boots on frozen ground, the jingle of spurs. Hollis went still. He raised one finger to his lips, then moved to the canvas flap and peered through a gap in the ties. Nora saw his shoulders tighten. He turned back to her, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Cord's men. 4 of them. Heading this way." Her stomach dropped. "Already?" Hollis glanced at the crate, at her, at the voices growing closer. Then he made a decision. He crossed to her in 2 strides, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her toward the back corner of the wagon, where a pile of canvas tarps lay bunched against the wall. "Get under," he said. "Do not move. Do not breathe loud. Do not make a sound unless you want a bullet." She scrambled under the tarps, pulling the heavy fabric over her head. The smell of dust and old rain filled her nose. She heard Hollis arrange the folds to look natural. Then his boots moved away. The wagon rocked as he climbed out. She lay frozen in the dark, heart slamming, and listened. The voices outside grew clear. "You, Cutter?" A man's voice, hard and nasal. Hollis answered, calm as stone. "That is right. What do you want?" "We are looking for a woman. Newspaper editor. Auburn hair, fancy dress, too smart for her own good. You seen her?" Nora pressed her hand over her mouth. "No," Hollis said. "I have been loading freight all evening. Have not seen anyone but yard workers." The man grunted. "Cord wants her found. Tonight. Says she took something that does not belong to her. Says anyone helping her is going to wish they had not." Hollis did not reply right away. When he did, his voice carried just a hint of edge. "I do not involve myself in local trouble. I haul freight. That is all." The man laughed, low and ugly. "That is real smart, Cutter. You keep it that way." The boots walked away. Nora counted to 60, then 90, then 200. Finally, the canvas flap rustled, and Hollis climbed back inside. He pulled the tarp off her and offered his hand. She took it, let him haul her to her feet. Her legs shook. "That was close," she whispered. He nodded. "Too close. And it is about to get worse." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He moved to the front of the wagon and started tying down the canvas flap, working fast. "Cord just put out word you are wanted, which means every hired gun and crooked deputy in the county is going to be looking for you by sunrise. You cannot go back to your office. You cannot go home. You cannot stay in Blue Creek." She felt the walls closing in. "So what do I do?" He finished the tie and turned to face her. "You come with me. I leave at first light. I can get you to the territorial office. But you do what I say. When I say it, no questions. Understood?" She stared at him. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." He picked up the folded land papers from where he had set them on a crate and held them up. "Because I know what these are," he said quietly. "And I know what kind of man forges land patents to steal homes from families who have been working that ground for 20 years. I have seen it before. I will not be part of it again." Something in his voice made her look closer. There was old anger there, buried deep. She nodded slowly. "All right. I will come with you. But I need to get a few things from my office first. Files, evidence, my notes on Cord." Hollis shook his head. "No. Too dangerous." She set her jaw. "I am not leaving without those files. Everything I have been building for 6 months is in that office. If I lose it, Cord wins even if we deliver the papers." Hollis stared at her. Then he let out a long breath and dragged his hand down his face. "You are going to get us both killed." But he reached for his coat. "All right. We go fast. We go quiet. And if anyone sees us, you run and you do not look back. Deal?" "Deal." They moved through the freight yard like shadows, keeping to the space between the wagons where the lantern light did not reach. The town was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. The kind that meant trouble was awake and hunting. Hollis led the way, one hand resting on his gun, eyes scanning every corner. Nora followed close, her breath quick and shallow in the cold. When they reached the edge of the yard, he stopped and looked back at her. "Stay behind me," he said. "If I tell you to run, you run." No arguing. She nodded. They crossed the street and slipped into the narrow alley beside the land office. The snow was starting to fall now, light and dry, dusting the frozen mud. Her newspaper office sat at the end of the next block. A narrow wooden building with a hand-painted sign that read Blue Creek Gazette in letters she had painted herself the day she bought the press. The front window was dark. Hollis put his hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he said. He studied the street, the shadows, the roof lines. Then he nodded. "Go." She hurried to the door, key already in her hand, and unlocked it as quietly as she could. Inside, the air smelled like ink and old paper and wood smoke from the stove she had let die hours ago. She did not light a lamp. She moved by memory, crossing to the desk where she kept her files locked in a drawer. Her hands shook as she worked the small key into the lock. Behind her, Hollis stood at the window, watching the street. "Hurry," he said softly. She pulled the drawer open and grabbed the leather folio that held 6 months of notes, interviews, and evidence. Then she pulled a second folio from under the desk, this one smaller, wrapped in oilcloth. Her private files. The ones she had never printed. The ones that proved Cord had not just stolen land. He had stolen her family's land 8 years ago, when her father died and the bank foreclosed on a debt that never existed. She had spent years hunting the proof. She had it now. She tucked both folios under her arm and turned toward the door. That was when she heard the boots on the porch. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Hollis turned from the window, his face grim. "Back door," he said. "Now." She ran for the narrow hallway that led to the back room. Behind her, she heard the front door crash open, heard a man shout her name. Hollis fired once, the sound deafening in the small space, and she heard a man curse. Then, Hollis was behind her, shoving her toward the back door. "Move," he snapped. She hit the door with her shoulder, stumbled out into the alley, and ran. The snow was falling harder now, swirling in the wind. She heard shouts behind her, more gunfire, the crack of wood splintering. Then, Hollis was beside her, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her into the shadows between two buildings. They pressed against the cold wall, both of them breathing hard, and listened. Boots pounded past the mouth of the alley. Voices shouted orders. Someone yelled to check the alleys. Hollis leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "We cannot go back to the freight yard. They will be watching it. We need another way out of town." Nora closed her eyes, thinking fast. "There is a livery stable on the south edge," she whispered. "Old man Jessup keeps horses there. He owes me a favor." Hollis nodded. "Can we get there without crossing Main Street?" She thought of the backlots, the empty space behind the church, the narrow path along the creek. "Yes. But we have to go now." He looked at her, and for just a second she saw something in his face that was not suspicion or calculation. It was something closer to respect. Then he took her hand. "Lead the way." They ran. They reached the livery stable 20 minutes later, both of them gasping for breath, snow coating their shoulders. The stable was dark except for a single lantern hanging by the door. Nora pounded on the wood. "Jessup," she called softly. "It is Nora Everly. I need help." For a long moment there was no answer. Then the door cracked open, and an old man's face appeared, gray-bearded and suspicious. "Miss Everly? What in blazes are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, pulling Hollis with her. "I need 2 horses. Fast ones. And I need you to forget you saw me." Jessup's eyes went to Hollis, to the gun on his hip, to the blood on his knuckles, then back to Nora. "You in trouble?" She nodded. "The kind that does not go away." Jessup was quiet for a beat. Then he sighed and moved toward the stalls. "Your daddy was a good man," he said. "He would not want me to leave you hanging." He led 2 horses out, a roan mare and a black gelding, both saddled and ready like he had known they might be needed. He handed the reins to Hollis. "These will get you to the pass if you ride hard. After that, you are on your own." Hollis nodded. "What do I owe you?" Jessup waved him off. "Just keep her alive. That is payment enough." Nora felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she whispered. Jessup gave her a sad smile. "Go on now, and do not come back till Cord is in chains or in the ground." They mounted and rode out into the snow. The storm hit them halfway to the pass. The wind came howling across the open prairie, driving the snow sideways, turning the world into a wall of white. Nora pulled her coat tighter and bent low over the mare's neck. Beside her, Hollis was a dark shape in the blizzard, his hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched against the wind. They rode for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into her bones, her fingers numb even inside her gloves. Finally, Hollis shouted over the wind, "We have to stop. We cannot see the trail. If the horses go lame, we are dead." She nodded, too cold to argue. He led them off the main trail and into a stand of cottonwoods where the wind was not quite so brutal. There was a small ravine, and at the bottom of it, a shallow cave cut into the rock. Not deep, but enough to block the worst of the storm. They dismounted and led the horses inside. Hollis tied them to a low branch and pulled the saddles off. Then he turned to Nora. She was shaking, her lips pale, her coat soaked through. He swore under his breath and pulled a rolled blanket from his saddlebag. "Sit," he said. She sank down against the cave wall. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, then crouched in front of her and started rubbing her hands between his. His hands were rough and warm and steady. She stared at him, too tired to speak. "You are tougher than you look," he said quietly. She let out a shaky laugh. "Is that a compliment?" He smiled, just a little. "Yeah, I think it is." For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he let go of her hands and sat back. "We will wait out the storm here. Should clear by morning. Then we ride hard for the territorial office. 2 days if we push." She nodded. "What if Cord sends men after us?" Hollis checked his revolver, thumbed fresh rounds into the empty chambers. "Then we make sure they do not catch us. And if they do," he met her eyes, "then I make sure you get to that office even if I do not." She felt something twist in her chest. "You do not have to do that. You do not owe me anything." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe not," he said. "But I owe someone. And this is as good a way as any to settle it." She wanted to ask what he meant. She wanted to know what debt he carried that made him risk his life for a stranger. But the exhaustion was pulling her under, and the warmth of the blanket and the fire he was building made her eyelids heavy. She let her head rest against the stone and closed her eyes. When she woke, the fire had burned low and the storm had quieted. Pale gray light filled the cave mouth. Hollis sat near the entrance, his back against the rock, his hat tipped low over his face. But she could see he was not asleep. His hand rested on his gun. She sat up slowly, the blanket sliding off her shoulders. He looked over at her. "Morning," he said. "How do you feel?" "Like I got trampled by a freight wagon," she said. He almost smiled. "That is about right." He stood and moved to the horses, checking their legs, their hooves. Then he turned back to her. "We should move. Cord will have men on the trail by now." She nodded and stood, folding the blanket. Hollis saddled the horses while she tied her hair back and tried to shake the stiffness from her limbs. When they rode out of the ravine, the world was white and still. The snow had stopped, but it lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound. They rode east, following the line of the hills, staying off the main trail. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds and the snow began to melt, turning the ground into cold mud. Nora's mare picked her way carefully over the uneven terrain. Hollis rode a few lengths ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She watched him, this man who had pulled a gun on her 12 hours ago and was now risking everything to help her. She knew almost nothing about him, but she knew he rode like someone who had spent more time running than standing still. And she knew the way he looked at those land papers. There was something personal in it. They stopped to rest the horses near a frozen creek. Hollis knelt by the ice and broke through with the butt of his knife, filling his canteen with the cold water underneath. Nora sat on a flat rock and pulled out a strip of dried beef from her saddlebag. She offered half to Hollis. He took it without a word and sat beside her. For a while, they ate in silence. Then she said, "You told those men you do not involve yourself in local trouble, but you involved yourself in mine. Why?" He chewed slowly, staring out at the white hills. "Because 8 years ago," he said, "my family lost our ranch to a man just like Cord. Same method. Forged papers, fake debts, a judge in his pocket. My father fought it, took it all the way to the territorial court. He lost. A month later, he rode out to confront the man who took our land. He did not come back. They found him in a ditch with a bullet in his back." She went still. Hollis did not look at her. "My mother died a year later. My sister married a farmer in Kansas, and I have not seen her since. I have been working freight ever since, moving from town to town, keeping my head down." He finally looked at her. "When you hid those papers in my wagon, you handed me something I have been too much of a coward to go looking for. A chance to do what my father could not." She shook her head. "You are not a coward." He gave her a long, measuring look. "Then what am I?" She met his eyes. Someone who survived, and someone who is choosing to fight now. That is not cowardice. That is just knowing when the odds are right. He held her gaze for a beat longer. Then he stood and walked back to his horse. "We should keep moving," he said. But his voice was softer than before. They rode hard for the rest of the day, pushing the horses as much as they dared. By late afternoon, they reached the low hills that marked the edge of Cord's territory. Hollis pulled up and studied the landscape. There was a narrow pass ahead, flanked by rock walls. The main trail ran through it. Nora reined her mare alongside him. "What is wrong?" He pointed to the pass. "If Cord sent men ahead, that is where they will be. High ground, narrow passage, perfect ambush point." She felt her stomach tighten. "So what do we do?" He scanned the hills. "There is another route. Longer, rougher, but it keeps us off the main trail. It will add half a day." She looked back the way they had come. "Can we afford half a day?" He looked at her. "Can we afford to ride into an ambush?" She nodded. "You are right. Lead the way." They turned south and followed a dry stream that cut between the hills. The ground was rocky and treacherous, and twice Nora's mare nearly stumbled. But Hollis kept them moving, his eyes always ahead, always watching. As the sun sank low, painting the hills gold and red, they crested a rise and saw the town of Miller's Fork spread out in the valley below. It was small, maybe 24 buildings, but there was smoke rising from chimneys and the warm glow of lamplight in windows. Hollis reined in and studied the town. "We can get a hot meal and a room," he said. "Rest the horses. Leave before dawn." Nora hesitated. "Is it safe?" He glanced at her. "Safer than riding all night in the cold. And if Cord's men are here, we will know soon enough." They rode down into the valley as the last light faded from the sky. The hotel was a narrow 2-story building at the end of the main street. Hollis paid for 2 rooms and told the clerk they were freight contractors heading east. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles, barely looked up from his ledger. Nora carried her saddlebag upstairs and locked the door behind her. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. She washed her face and hands, scrubbing away 2 days of dust and fear. Then she sat on the bed and opened the leather folio. Her notes stared back at her, pages and pages of dates, names, testimony, proof of every crooked deal Cord had made for the last 5 years. And beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, the deed to her family's ranch. Stolen 8 years ago. Never recovered. Until now. She ran her fingers over the faded ink and felt the old wound crack open. Her father had been a proud man. Too proud to ask for help. Too proud to believe that the law could be bought. He had died believing he had failed his family. She had spent 8 years trying to prove he had not. A soft knock at the door made her look up. She crossed to the door and opened it a crack. Hollis stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands. "I am going down to get food," he said. "You should eat." She nodded. "I will come with you." They went downstairs to the small dining room off the hotel lobby. There were only 3 other people there, all of them travelers passing through. Hollis ordered stew and bread for both of them. When the food came, Nora realized how hungry she was. She ate quickly, barely tasting it. Hollis watched her with a faint smile. "When did you last eat a real meal?" She thought about it. 2 days ago. Maybe 3. He shook his head. "You cannot run on ink and anger forever." She met his eyes. "I have been doing all right so far." He leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, I noticed. But sooner or later, you are going to need to let someone help you carry the load." She set down her spoon. "Like you?" He did not look away. "Maybe." Before she could answer, the door to the dining room opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a silver star pinned to his vest. His eyes swept the room and landed on Hollis. Then on Nora. He crossed to their table and stopped. His face was hard, weathered, unreadable. "Evening," he said. "I am Marshall Pike. I am looking for a woman named Nora Everly." Nora's heart stopped. Hollis went very still, his hand sliding toward his hip. The marshal raised one hand, palm out. "Easy, son. I am not here to arrest anyone. I am here because Judge Cord put out a warrant claiming Miss Everly stole county documents. But I have been a marshal for 20 years, and I know William Cord. So before I go hauling anyone back to Blue Creek, I want to hear her side." Nora forced herself to breathe. She looked at Hollis. He gave the smallest nod. She turned back to the marshal. "I am Nora Everly," she said, "and I did take documents from Cord's office. But they were not his. They were forged land patents he used to steal property from families all over the county. I have the papers, and I have 6 months of evidence proving he has been running a fraud operation with the cooperation of at least 2 county officials." The marshal studied her for a long beat. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me." She glanced at Hollis again. He nodded. She went upstairs, retrieved the leather folio, and brought it back down. She spread the papers on the table. The marshal read in silence, his face growing darker with each page. Finally, he sat back and let out a long breath. "I knew Cord was crooked," he said. "But I did not know he was this crooked." He looked at Nora. "You realize if you testify with this, he will do everything in his power to destroy you." She lifted her chin. "He already tried. I am still here." The marshal almost smiled. "All right, Miss Everly. I will escort you to the territorial office myself. We leave at dawn." Hollis leaned forward. "What about the warrant?" The marshal stood. "There is no warrant. Not a legal one, anyway. Cord does not have the authority to issue territory-wide paper. He is bluffing." He looked at Nora. "But that does not mean his men will not try to stop you. So you stay close to me until we reach the capital. Understood?" She nodded. "Thank you, Marshal." He tipped his hat. "Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long ride." After the marshal left, Hollis walked Nora back upstairs. They stopped outside her door. She turned to face him. "That went better than I expected," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, but it is not over yet. Cord will not let this go. Even if we get the papers to the land office, even if the sales get voided, he is still going to come after you." She knew he was right. "But I have to try," she said softly. "I have to finish what my father started." Hollis looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. His touch was careful, almost tentative. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "I hope so." They stood there in the narrow hallway, the lamplight flickering on the walls, and something unspoken passed between them. Then Hollis stepped back. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will be right across the hall if you need anything." She nodded and slipped inside her room, but it was a long time before she fell asleep. They left Miller's Fork before sunrise, Marshal Pike rode ahead, his rifle across his saddle. Hollis and Nora followed side by side, the horses moving at a steady trot through the cold morning. The marshal set a hard pace, stopping only to water the horses and check the trail behind them. By midday, they had covered 20 miles. By evening, they were deep into territory Cord did not control. Nora felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Maybe they were going to make it. Maybe this was going to work. But that night, as they made camp in a shallow canyon, Hollis saw the smoke. He stood at the edge of the firelight, staring back the way they had come. 3 riders, he said quietly. Maybe 4. Staying just out of sight. The marshal stood and checked his rifle. How long have they been there? Since we left Miller's Fork, Hollis said. The marshal swore under his breath. Cord's men. They are waiting for the right moment, probably hoping we will lead them to the papers so they can take them and us both. Nora felt the fear creep back in. What do we do? The marshal looked at Hollis. You any good with that gun? Hollis met his eyes. Good enough. The marshal nodded. All right. We keep moving. But we do not make it easy for them. Tomorrow we take the high trail through Devil's Ridge. Narrow pass. Hard ground. If they want to take us, they will have to do it in the open. And if they try? Hollis asked. Then we make sure they regret it. They broke camp before dawn and rode hard for the ridge. The trail climbed steeply, winding through rock walls and scrub pine. The air grew colder as they climbed, and the wind picked up, whistling through the stones. Halfway up, the marshal reined in and pointed. There. 4 riders, moving fast, closing the distance. Hollis turned to Nora. Stay with the marshal. Do not stop, no matter what happens. She grabbed his arm. What are you going to do? He pulled free, his face set. What I have to. He turned his horse and rode back down the trail. The marshal swore and spurred his horse forward. Come on, Miss Everly. We do not have time to argue. Nora followed, her heart hammering. Behind her, she heard the crack of gunfire. Once, twice, then a volley. She did not look back. The marshal led her up through the narrow pass and out onto a high plateau. They rode hard across the open ground, the wind tearing at their coats. Then, finally, she heard hoofbeats behind them. She turned, expecting the worst. But it was Hollis. Alone. His hat was gone. His coat torn. Blood on his sleeve. But he was alive. He pulled alongside her, breathing hard. They are not following us anymore, he said. The marshal looked back, then nodded grimly. Let us keep it that way. They rode on. They reached the territorial office 2 days later. It was a low stone building in the center of the capital, flanked by government offices and a courthouse. Marshal Pike dismounted and helped Nora down. Hollis tied the horses and followed them inside. The clerk at the desk looked up, bored. We need to see the land commissioner, the marshal said. Now. The clerk blinked. Do you have an appointment? The marshal leaned on the desk. I have evidence of federal land fraud involving forged patents and territorial corruption. So no, I do not have an appointment. But you are going to get the commissioner down here in the next 5 minutes, or I am going to make sure everyone in this building knows you are the reason a crooked judge stays in business. The clerk went pale. He stood and hurried through a side door. 5 minutes later, a tall man in a dark suit appeared. He introduced himself as Commissioner Dalton. The marshal handed him the leather folio. Dalton read in silence, his face growing darker. Finally, he looked up. "This is serious, very serious. Where did you get these documents?" Nora stepped forward. "I took them from Judge Cord's private office. I am the editor of the Blue Creek Gazette. I have been investigating Cord for 6 months. Everything in that file is verified." Dalton studied her. Then he nodded. "I will open a formal investigation immediately. In the meantime, I am issuing an emergency suspension of all pending foreclosures in Blue Creek County until this matter is resolved." Nora felt her knees go weak. The Morrow family. Juniper Ranch. Are they safe? Dalton checked the file. The foreclosure was scheduled for tomorrow. They are safe now. She closed her eyes and let out a breath she had been holding for days. "Thank you." Dalton looked at the marshal. "I will need Miss Everly to stay in the Capitol to testify when the investigation proceeds." The marshal nodded. "I will make sure she has a place to stay." Hollis stepped forward. "And after that? What happens to Cord?" Dalton met his eyes. "If this evidence holds, Judge William Cord will be arrested, tried, and removed from office. And every family he defrauded will have the opportunity to reclaim their land." Hollis was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Good." They walked out into the late afternoon sun. Nora stood on the steps of the land office and felt the weight of 6 months lift off her shoulders. "We did it," she said quietly. The marshal clapped her on the shoulder. "You did it, Miss Everly. I just kept you alive long enough to finish." He tipped his hat. "I will check in tomorrow. For now, get some rest." He walked away, leaving Nora and Hollis standing alone on the steps. She turned to him. "You saved my life. Twice, maybe 3 times. I do not even know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You do not owe me thanks. You gave me something I did not know I needed. A reason to stop running." She stepped closer. "So what happens now? Do you go back to hauling freight?" He looked at her. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw something uncertain in his face. "I do not know," he said. "I have been moving for so long, I am not sure I remember how to stay." She reached out and took his hand. "Maybe you could learn." He looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked back at her. "And maybe you could teach me." She smiled, slow and real. "I think I would like that." He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face. "Then, let me stay," he said quietly. "Let me help you rebuild what Cord tried to destroy. Let me be part of something that matters." Her throat tightened. "You already are." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, and she felt the last of her walls come down. 3 months later, Nora stood in the doorway of the rebuilt newspaper office and watched the sun set over Blue Creek. The town had changed. Cord was in a territorial prison awaiting trial. The families he had defrauded were back on their land. The Morrow family had thrown a celebration at Juniper Ranch that lasted 2 days. And Nora Everly, once the lone voice shouting into the wind, was now the editor of a paper people trusted. Hollis came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You should come inside," he said. "Dinner is getting cold." She leaned back against him. In a minute. I just want to look at it for a while. He rested his chin on her shoulder. Look at what? She gestured to the street, the buildings, the people walking home in the dusk. This. All of it. Everything we fought for. He was quiet for a moment. You know, he said, when I first pulled that gun on you in my freight wagon, I thought you were the most reckless woman I had ever met. She laughed. And now? Now I think you are the bravest. And the stubbornness. And the most beautiful. She turned in his arms. You are not so bad yourself. He kissed her forehead. I have been thinking. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. He smiled. I want to buy a piece of land. Just outside town. Build a house. Maybe start a freight business that does not involve running from hired guns. She felt her heart swell. That sounds like staying. He nodded. Yeah. It does. She reached up and touched his face. Then let us stay. Together. He kissed her, long and slow, and the last light of the day turned everything gold. 6 months after that, the freight business was thriving. Hollis hired 2 drivers and bought a 3rd wagon. Nora expanded the Gazette, hiring a young printer's apprentice, and adding a weekly women's column written by the wives and daughters of the families Court had tried to destroy. They were married in the spring, in the church at the edge of town, with half of Blue Creek in attendance. Marshal Pike gave the toast. The Morrow family brought enough food to feed an army, and when Hollis kissed his bride, the whole town cheered. That night, in the small house they had built on the land Hollis bought, Nora sat by the window and looked out at the stars. Hollis came up behind her and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Cold? She shook her head. Just thinking. About what? About how much can change in a year. About how sometimes the most dangerous choice turns out to be the only right one. He sat beside her. Do you regret it? Any of it? She turned to him, not for a second. He smiled and pulled her close. Good. Because I have been thinking about expanding the house. Adding a room or 2. She raised an eyebrow. Planning ahead? He kissed her temple. Always. She laughed and rested her head on his shoulder. Then let us plan together. A year later, Nora was at her desk in the Gazette office when the door opened, and a young woman walked in. She was thin, travel-worn, with dark hair and eyes that looked too old for her face. She carried a worn satchel and a look of desperate hope. Are you Miss Everly? She asked. Nora set down her pen. I am Mrs. Cutter now. But yes. Can I help you? The woman stepped forward. My name is Sarah Brennan. I am from a town called Red River, 2 counties west. We have a problem. A man named Maddox has been buying up land and forcing families out. He has a judge in his pocket, and no one will stand up to him. I heard what you did here. I heard you took down a corrupt judge and saved your town. She swallowed hard. I was hoping you could tell me how. Nora looked at the young woman for a long moment. Then she stood and crossed to the door. Hollis was outside, loading crates into a wagon. She called his name. He looked up. We have a visitor, she said, and I think we might be taking a trip. He raised an eyebrow. What kind of trip? The kind where we help someone who needs it, she said. He studied her face. Then he grinned. All right. Let me finish loading. We can leave in an hour. Nora turned back to Sarah. Sit down, she said gently. Tell me everything. And do not leave anything out. Sarah sat, and as she began to speak, Nora felt the old fire kindle in her chest. The fight was not over. It never really was. But this time, she was not fighting alone. The town of Red River was worse than Nora had expected. The main street was half empty, businesses boarded up, families packing wagons to leave. Maddox owned the bank, the land office, and the loyalty of every man with a gun. But he did not own the people. Not yet. Nora and Hollis spent 2 weeks gathering evidence, interviewing families, documenting every crooked deal. Sarah Brennan helped, moving through the town like a shadow, talking to people who were too afraid to speak openly. And when they had enough, Nora wrote the story. She printed it on a borrowed press in the back room of a closed-down general store. She distributed it herself, walking from house to house, leaving a copy on every doorstep. The next morning, the town woke up to the truth. By noon, a crowd had gathered in front of the land office. By evening, the territorial marshal arrived. And by the end of the week, Maddox was in chains. Nora stood in the street and watched the marshal's wagon roll out of town, Maddox in the back, his face twisted with rage. Sarah Brennan stood beside her, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Nora put her arm around the younger woman. You did this, she said. You were brave enough to ask for help. That is where it starts. Hollis walked up, his coat dusty, his face tired but satisfied. Ready to go home? Nora looked at him. Then she looked at Sarah. Actually, she said, I was thinking we might stay a few more days. Make sure things settle. Help them get the paper running again. Hollis smiled. Of course you were. He took her hand. All right, a few more days. Then we go home. She squeezed his hand. Deal. They returned to Blue Creek a week later. The house smelled like home. Nora stood in the kitchen and made coffee while Hollis unpacked their bags. When he came back downstairs, she handed him a cup and sat beside him at the table. That is the 3rd town this year, she said. He nodded. I know. She looked at him. Do you mind? The traveling? The danger? The fighting other people's battles? He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. When I was running, he said, I was empty. I was just moving to keep from standing still long enough to feel how much I had lost. But this, what we are doing, it fills that empty space. It makes the loss mean something. So no, I do not mind. She felt her eyes sting. I love you. He smiled. I know. I love you too. She leaned across the table and kissed him. When she pulled back, he was grinning. What? She asked. He shook his head. Nothing. Just thinking about how I pulled a gun on you the first time we met. And now look at us. She laughed. Best decision you ever made. He raised his coffee cup. To bad decisions that turn out right. She clinked her cup against his. To second chances. They drank. And outside the window, the sun set over the town they had saved together. 2 years later, Nora Cutter stood on the porch of their house and watched the prairie turn gold in the afternoon light. Inside, a baby slept in a cradle Hollis had built with his own hands. The Gazette was thriving. The freight business was steady, and the house was full of the kind of quiet joy Nora had once believed was only for other people. Hollis came out and stood beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "She is asleep," he said. "Finally." Nora leaned into him. "Good. Maybe we will get an hour of peace." He kissed the top of her head. "I will take it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light change. Then Nora said, "Do you ever think about that night in the wagon, when you found the papers?" He laughed softly. "Every day." She looked up at him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had turned me in?" He shook his head. "No, because I did not. And I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." She felt her throat tighten. Even knowing everything that came after? The danger, the fighting, the long roads? He turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face. "Especially knowing that," he said, "because all of it led here. To you. To this. To a life I never thought I deserved." She kissed him, slow and sure. "You deserve it," she whispered. "We both do." He held her close, and the prairie wind carried the smell of summer grass and distant rain. And Nora Cutter, who had once been a woman alone against the world, knew she would never be alone again.